Meeting to order at 7:01. Has there been a declaration of public notice?
Yep.
All right, order of business. No public appearances today. Can I have a motion for the consent agenda?
I move the consent agenda as presented.
Second.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Ayes have it, motion is carried. All right, next, our recognitions.
In Dr. Olson's absence, congratulations to Bree Murphy, the high school girls basketball coach who was recently named Coach of the Week. The positive influence she has on the team does not go unnoticed. We're grateful to have Bree as a leader, and there's a link to the article in that part. Secondly, Ms. Lang, a special ed EA, and Miss Connor's kindergarten class had a special visitor last week. Miss Lang's daughter, a junior at Monona Grove High School, stopped by to volunteer after completing her finals to read and participate in some fun activities. The kindergartners really loved having an older student in their classroom and even missed her when she wasn't in class the next day. And there are photos attached for the board to see as well for that gathering. And third, congratulations to the boys and girls basketball teams and the boys hockey team who all enjoyed a victory in the recent games. The girls basketball team defeated Beaver Dam in overtime, also taking first place as undefeated in the Badger East Conference. The boys basketball team also won their game over the weekend in overtime with a final score of 72-65. The boys hockey team took home the Wabesa Cup and is now Wabesa Cup and is now in third place in their conference. I should have asked the hockey expert to pronounce it. And there are links to that information as well. And that would be the recognition information for this evening.
All right, thank you, Mark. There are no correspondence and announcements, and the administrative report will be next meeting with Dan. And go on to board reports. So starting off.
Do we just want to mention that we have superintendent?
I'm going to do that in the state.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So next is the State Education Convention. So we all have the opportunity of attending the WASB meeting. And the biggest deal was our own superintendent received Superintendent of the Year. So congratulations, Dan. And we'll have some celebratory activities next meeting. So we're excited to talk about it more. All right.
And we should also recognize that Jared Rosing, our former business
Absolutely.
administrator, was recognized as Business Administrator of the
Yes.
Year and was nominated for his work here at Monona.
Actually won the award while he was still.
That was awarded
here.
that.
Yeah, it was awarded here.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, they were at the same time, so we
Yeah,
couldn't
yeah.
watch both.
Yeah.
Here's what was really nice. At the general, but in the general session on Wednesday, they actually, in the general session, they brought those people forward and kind of gave them a certificate. So Dan came forward and Jared came forward. The interesting thing, and we teased them a little bit about this, is they told you which school boards to stand. And so when Jared got up, of course, it wasn't us. And I kept trying to get Susan to stand up. And Jared
Not appropriate.
did come afterwards and say, you should have stood up. So that was cute.
Would anyone else like to share anything about the state convention?
Yeah, we're actually, isn't it required by policy?
It is required by policy.
Oh,
that
okay.
we- that
To
we all
give-
some minor report.
Oh, okay.
We did. I think the thinking, I assume the thinking is that since the district pays for us to go, we should attend, we should talk about it.
Sure.
But,
Who would like to
well,
start?
delegate assembly set a
Yeah.
record, for which I replaced Andrew on that, and I always enjoy it because it's policy stuff, and I like that kind of thing. But it went on for 4 hours. We spent 1 hour arguing about whether to add voter education to the list of just general liberal arts curricula that should be. There's civics and government, and people just wanted to add voter education because there are all these different ways to get ballots, and who knew it would be that controversial. There was a gun rights one that I thought would be much more controversial. That one was maybe a half hour, but voter education an hour. So it was pretty amazing. But all of them passed except the universal free lunch, which the main concern there was the cost, and that when we're all in these financial straits, apparently the predominant feeling was that it was difficult to ask the legislature to pay for lunches for families that could afford it. It's kind of argument that went on during the federal thing. I know there are some legislators working on it. I have no idea what the trajectory is, but as we all know, there are students who qualify for free and reduced lunch who don't apply for it. There are also families that are right on the edge that maybe don't qualify but need it. So it would be a big deal to have breakfast and lunch for all students. So maybe at some point that will happen.
Yeah.
But it was interesting. Otherwise, those were probably the most controversial things. The one we had talked about did pass, but there were other reasons for that as well. So, and the other thing, I guess, that I was in the convention that I kind of got the most into was one on reading, on science of reading, and I'll be on this. I just want to talk to you more about it because I was really excited about it. There is a school district that's gotten their kids to like 90-95% proficient in the elementary level by using these different techniques, and it's not a curriculum, but it's just really a strong emphasis on phonics. So it was very interesting, and I followed up and got a lot of free materials, which is why I'll step up, because they were handing out free books, so I took one of each of them. So anyway, that's it.
For me, I'm glad that both you, Susan Fox and Susan Manning, encouraged me to attend the session on by Sharita that talked about how to talk, nicely and trying to, even though you're being assertive, you also should watch how you say things. And I just thought she just gave a really excellent presentation, and haven't read the book yet, but I'm gonna start to read the book, but it looks really interesting.
Yeah.
You into the lunch?
I did. I have nothing of value to add, so.
That was pretty good. And I thought, Dan, well, I'll do, so technically, I think we're supposed to just kind of tell you things we went to, and I'm hoping Peter will tell us. The one you talked to me about, I thought was interesting, because that was the one you didn't like. One of the first ones, it was early.
Well, the one I didn't like, what was that? Oh,
Yeah, that was like a whole list of things. But the very first, I went to the pre-conference, and I went to the Coordinating Crisis Response in the National Incident Management System, and I thought, do I really understand all that? And Jim has already done a really nice job of presenting all that. But this was really well done in that they were saying to boards, you need to understand planning for and executing response and recovery activities through your emergency operation plans. And I thought, okay, so that's a challenge for us. We're getting that information, but we need to understand it. So, and for each building, so they kind of went through formats and things. It was, it was an almost 4-hour program, but it was really quite good. And then on Wednesday, I went to the breakout, and Susan was also there, and it's called Winning at Culture Rather Than Losing to Politics. And that title really tells you what they talked about. They defined culture and then presented clear processes for establishing communication standards, reviewed ethics in the boardroom, and how to work on board improvement, similar to things that Serena did. Then I went to the general session that day, and the Belle Phillips Memorial High School Wind Ensemble was excellent. And then the WASA president recognized the administrators and educators of the year, including Dan Olson as superintendent of the year. So that was really nice because it was in a big general session, so everybody could see that. And then Jared was also addressed as director of business services of the year, which was really nice, and it made us feel good. And then that was followed by Speaker David Horsager, who spoke about the concept of trust and how important trust is in the work that we do. Then there was a breakout that was also excellent, and I think some of you probably heard Dan Nerad. He used to be the superintendent at Madison, and then went to Detroit and has since been back working for WSB. He talked about elevation achievement for all through a focus on excellence and equity. And he took equity and excellence and just integrated them into almost one word. It was really well done. Then another excellent breakout after that one was the legislative update from the School Administrators Alliance. And this woman has been a legislative aid for so many people, and she had so much knowledge about the legislation. It was absolutely incredible. And again, she talked about the issues being educational funding, mental health, and special ed. And then on Wednesday, I was at the WSB networking session, and Susan was there, and we were just sitting at a table. And Serena Maben, who was the speaker that you heard, sat down at our table and started telling us all these amazing things. So we had a really nice experience prior to the actual speaking event. And then we appeared at a thing for Jill Underly, and then we went to the McKinstry, who are our real true partners in energy conservation. Then Thursday, again, it was awesome. It was the WACB breakfast, but you have to get up you have to be down there dressed at 7 o'clock. But it was Tom Thibodeau. Michelle's not here tonight. He's just incredible. You know, we were thinking, we've already heard, I mean, he just did a whole different story, and he just provides great positive leadership and community engagement thoughts. Then I went to the breakout on staff-student boundaries, which was excellent because of the policy work that we do. And you've really got to make sure those boundaries are there in a way, and yet they can still have strong feelings supportive feelings about each other. It was done by Whitefish Bay Superintendent Dr. John Thompson, who was around quite a bit. And he was very good and did an excellent idea. Excellent. And he talked about the importance of solid district policies and a board member's role in refining the policy to make sure it works. It was excellent. Then we went to the WASTA Luncheon featuring Dan Olson, Superintendent of the Year, who told his story of his progress through administrative levels in his work with Monona Grove School District. It was really great to sit and listen to that. And then Dan had a little event from 1:30 to 4. And then 3 to 5, the general session was Sarita, who talked about positive work through conversations. And then there was a weapon event for Jill Underly, then the Findorf and Architect program. Then Friday was the WASB legislative update, similar themes that everybody else is getting. And the general session was with the governor, which was wonderful that he could come.
Thank you, Susan. Elizabeth, I just wanted to talk about the luncheon a little bit. I thought the luncheon was awesome, and I thought we saw a softer side of things.
Yes, I agree.
Learning about his family history.
I just like the way he's like come into education. I thought was really great. So I very much enjoyed it.
The story was great. Well, and it was also kind of fun to meet his mother
Yes.
and his children.
Yeah.
And see the family there who have clearly supported him through this pathway.
Could ask his son to sit in. They wouldn't have been able to tell the difference on Monona Community Media. They look identical.
Eric and Peter?
I went to a workshop on the state funding and financial fiscal cliff that we're going to have.
Mm-hmm.
And they talked about how Wisconsin ranks 25th out of all the United States in funding, per pupil funding. So even though Mr. Voss says we're paying $14,000 on average per student, it still lacks quite a bit compared to other states. We'll probably be closer to 30 when the next one comes out. Per pupil funding revenue caps kind of lag inflation by $3,200 since 2009. If you add to that the ESSER funding that the state legislature told us to use, which is going to expire in 2024, and combine it with declining birth rates across the nation, that makes the financial cliff that we're in, which is why one of the reasons the main reason we're going to referendum. And I'm glad that we are, because there really is not any other options for a district like us.
Gap.
What's that?
To fill that gap.
No,
That,
there's
I mean,
not.
your slide is that big gap, and there aren't any options to fill that gap.
$3,200 per pupil, no.
That's right.
I mean, that's keeping up with index to CPI. If it was GDP, it'd be even bigger, but.
Eric, did they talk about any solutions in the
Going to referendum.
referendum? Yeah.
So schools that did not go to referendum in the last election cycle, most likely are going in this cycle. And this isn't a problem specific to Wisconsin. This is a problem nationwide. So,
But it's more acute in Wisconsin.
Well, when you rank 25th, and you're probably going to be closer to 30 the next
Right.
when the next numbers come out, that it has to make you think: do we really want to be in the lower half of per pupil funding in the United States? I don't.
May I? When we moved to Wisconsin in 2003, we did it because my kids were entering school age, and we believed that we were seeing places with good schools. And at the time, Wisconsin was in the top 5 of state funding. And you can draw almost a straight line between National Assessment of Education Progress, testing, and outcomes, and state funding on education. And Wisconsin was spent in the top 5, and they were in the top 5 in outcomes. And now they're in 25th, and outcomes are sinking towards the median.
Yeah.
And it's sad. Because this was one of the things this state used to be known for, was the quality education. And it's why people like me, families, moved here. You know, and I did, and I brought $1 million business with me at the time when I did, you know, from California to Wisconsin. And I would not do it again at this point. It would end up someplace else because of what's going on. It's been going on for 20 years now, Wisconsin funding, education funding. Did you have more to report on?
I just had one more thing, the budget timeline. The governor delivered the state last night. Then on February 15th, he'll deliver the biennial budget message. And then in February and March, the Joint Finance Committee will receive the budget, and they'll hold a public hearing, and then they'll eventually vote on the budget. So I'd encourage anybody to, give feedback during that process, because I think it's really important
Yeah.
for them to hear it from everybody,
Yes.
especially Monona Grove. Monona and Cottage Grove.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric. Peter?
A little all over the place. Usually at these things, I like to sort of focus on a particular topic and then attend sessions that sort of relate to that, try and get multiple points of view, but I didn't really do that this time. I went to a number of things. For example, the one I think you were talking about is the one where they were talking about start times, right? They went to presentation, and it was the results of a survey where they talked to superintendents about high school start times. The research is very clear that we should be starting high schools at 8:30, but nobody does. And the question is why? And this fellow, interviewed and surveyed superintendents and presented his results. And I went because I thought you get some perspective about superintendents, and I did. Not particularly about this issue, but I did, which is kind of this, which is everybody was expecting that the survey would show, oh, we can't do this because of buses. We can't do this because of athletics.
Yeah.
We can't do this because of that. And those things generally superintendents felt they could handle on. But the number one issue that was their concern was financial impact on families when they do that shift in terms of childcare, in terms of after-school work, and so on. So that was kind of interesting, but it wasn't the interesting thing about superintendents. They could solve all of the technical problems they felt, and it was these other community problems. And there was some discussion, and it was not determined whether that was a real factor or not, or how significant a factor that was. It was just a feeling that was a factor. And then if they're doing that, they're afraid of making a mistake if there's a big impact like that. So on that particular issue, it requires more research, but it did give me it's kind of insightful into the way superintendents look at the world and what the challenges in front of them, and why they can't make change. And it's not what everybody assumed was going to be buses. It's going to be,
sports.
Things like that. Went to some other things. One of the things that was interesting to me, I went to a financial one. They talked about, this one was talking about the Wisconsin's funding formula and the inequities built into the system. And there's a couple of things I learned about that. One is that we consider ourselves, sort of the winners in this system because we're, even regardless of the inadequacies, we're in a better situation than a lot of school districts, except we're not as well off as we think we are. Because what goes along with these schools that are funded higher is the amount of money we spend subsidizing special needs students is also higher. And there's also almost a one-to-one correlation between how well a district was funded and how well they were talking about. And so, and you take that out, that takes $1,000 essentially out of, if you sort of were to average that out, level that out, you would have to subtract $1,000 from our general student population revenue. Compared to everybody else spends, at the lower end, they're subsidizing. Put it this way, every student is subsidizing the special needs students by, on average in Wisconsin, $1,000. In our area, and for us, it's like $2,000, an extra $1,000. And that levels the playing field a lot from what we think is the fact that we are ahead of other school districts. It's less so than we think we are. So that was an interesting something I learned. Those folks, they're interesting because they believe that the state's funding formula is a violation of the state constitution, which guarantees equitable education across the state, and they believe that it is in fact in violation of the constitution, and they are really what they're doing is collecting data and information in case work for around preparing a lawsuit about funding formula if they can't. And of course, they're lobbying, they're talking to legislators about it because they'd rather not do it in court.
Right.
But they're lobbying for change to the system, which is also a challenge. So.
Very interesting. Susan?
Well, yeah, I mean, just to add to those inequities, in 1993, when they established the revenue limits, they were for each district based on the spending of your district that year. So if you were doing really due diligence and you were a low-spending district, you got penalized forever. Like, I mean, those people all have lower ceilings, and they've tried different things to sort of equalize.
That was supposed to be
It was like a
for
one-time?
5 years. It was one-time
It was supposed to
thing
be
when
for
it was
5 years, yeah.
and they've
went
kept
on.
it since.
Yeah, they've kept it. And the other thing
Sorry,
is when you
can
mentioned.
that's before my time, so what happened?
It was in 1993 when they established revenue limits, the school districts. It was based on your funding of that year.
And then that's just
that-
in
And then
perpetuity?
it was supposed to be for 5 years, but they've just extended it. So that's our problem, is that when the legislators will talk about giving us more money, it doesn't mean we have more money to spend because if they don't raise our limits, which
Right.
they haven't done for the last 2 years.
And that part I got, I didn't
But some of
realize
these
that our
districts, yeah,
cap
are-
was from a static figure from 1993.
Well, it was, the amount of increase wasn't static, but the limit itself was based on that year. So even
Got
if you
it.
add 200 per student, if you started low,
Right,
you're never going to catch up.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the funding for special education, which, currently we are reimbursed for, hopefully, we don't know yet, but maybe 30 cents on the dollar. I mean, usually it ends up being less than what they say it's going to be, but we don't know this year. I don't know if you know yet.
They claim it's going to be shooting up to 45, but that's beside the point. But
For
right
this
now it's
past
about,
year, or that's the goal?
well, that's the goal.
Well, yeah, that's the goal,
ask.
but,
Right now it's about 30.
right, it's about 30 this way, but we don't always necessarily get 30.
And it's a
but-
sum certain, so,
Yeah.
Yeah.
it goes like through the aid formula, it goes through and everybody goes together and then they disperse it.
Yeah.
So.
And that's another key thing, it's some certain for public schools, meaning they set aside a pot of money and then they divide it up on the costs, whereas for private voucher schools, or voucher schools and other schools, it's some sufficient, and they get paid roughly 90% of their cost of special education students. And all of this money, of course, is coming out of the general education fund, so
Yeah.
it's just one more inequity.
Essentially, Elizabeth, in 1993, if there was a $1,000 difference in your net spending per student, you still have that $1,000
Yeah.
difference.
Yeah. No,
It's propagated.
Yeah,
Right.
no, I understand it now,
Along.
I just wanted to make sure I was understanding it right because it sounded
It's just
insane.
It used to go up by,
The idea
for-
was the allocation was the increase every year is supposed to keep up with inflation and always hasn't.
Right.
Or it's not been anything like the last 2 years where they.
Yeah,
cut
where it's
like
just nothing.
$500 cut in
well, and back when
11.
they.
Yeah.
And prior to '93, it was all property taxes.
Yep.
And so, depending on the property values of the district and what people could afford, there was an equity that was, and they got rid of that system because of the inequities.
Right.
But they also froze the inequities in place when they got rid of the
Yeah.
system. It's,
And a lot
bizarre.
of districts, or some especially conservative districts, said, oh, we got to cut because we're getting penalized if we spend too much. It goes back to what Susan was saying, is you were locked in, so if you would have been foreseen,
Right.
you would have bumped up all
Yeah,
those
yeah. It would have just
expenditures
been
that
like-
year, and then,
We're just gonna buy all the things.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it.
And we still, we're, Madison suburb with fairly
Yeah.
high, so we were on the high end of that spending. and we
Yeah.
continue to be on the high end of that
Yeah.
spending.
Thank you, Peter. All right, moving on to Teaching, Learning, and Equity Committee, Elizabeth.
Yeah, so the Teaching, Learning, and Equity Committee met on Monday, the 23rd. It was a lovely meeting. We had 2 items on the agenda. One was an update on the curricular review process for social emotional learning, and then we also had a discussion and presentation around elevating student voice. So for social emotional learning, Lisa Hype and Krista Foster described the current status of our SEL Curriculum Review Committee. The committee consists of representatives from each building, and it's a variety of folks, so classroom teachers and student services and specialists. And so Krista was sharing that she feels like it's a really good cross-representation, lots of varying perspectives, lots of varying amounts of knowledge in terms of how much you know about SEL or have implemented SEL. So I think that's going to be really neat. I think we're going to have good results because of that. They're right now looking at some grounding documents from CASEL, Learning for Justice, and DPI, and then they're in the process of reviewing the current state of our social emotional learning across K-12, and then we'll utilize sort of the seminal documents, their discussion, our current state, to make determinations about where we're going in terms of the standards, and then eventually the outcome will be to choose curricula and materials that then align with those standards that they're selecting. And then the second part of our agenda was around student voice, and so we received information from all schools. All schools submitted a slide or several slides in some schools' cases that shared what they're doing as it relates to student voice. But then we had the pleasure of hearing directly from Joel Jarosky from MT21, Emily Foster from Taylor Prairie, and Angie Fassel from Winnequa. And as you all will remember, elevating student voice is a really important tactic in our strategic plan. And so part of under the teaching and learning component is around elevating student voice, and then the kind of sub-objective for this year is around developing mechanisms for us to collect and amplify those things. So at MG21, this was really interesting. Joel shared that they have a student voice committee that they've been running for a number of years, and it really plays like a true governance role at MG21. They meet, they vote to have, they had representation on their own governance board, they talk about policy, that they, like little P policy that they want to implement at the school, culture and climate, all kinds of things. And he shared the model that he uses for that with everyone on the committee. And he said that he is open to chatting with anyone kind of in district who would be interested in starting something like that, particularly at kind of our secondary grade levels. And then Emily shared, on the other end of the learning spectrum, Emily shared about Taylor Prairie's Learning Partner Initiative, which is really neat. So in each class, there's a student who's designated as the learning partner for the teacher in the class. And the learning partner and their family engage in dialogue around like how you're feeling about the curriculum and how you're feeling about the culture. And the students give like real feedback. Which then they use in coordination with some also observations that they do in the classroom to try to get like themes around what's working and what's not from a student perspective. And then if you look at Taylor Prairie's data dashboard, in addition to having kind of the standard data that you would expect, right, like the iReady data and our reading and math scores and attendance, they also have a section around student voice themes too. So it's like right front and center when they think about data. So I thought that was really neat. And then Angie shared about Winnequa. They are infusing goals around student voice both at the building level and also at the team and staff level. And one of the really cool innovative things that they're doing, and I'm really excited to see how this turns out because I've never heard it utilized this way, is that they're taking the concept of circles that you find like in restorative practices, like after a harm has been done, right, and you sit folks, students in a space, and you ask questions and they're allowed to sort of make comments on things that are happening sort of towards a goal, usually that goal around repairing some kind of harm or a cultural concern. They're working on piloting using that circle process for academic feedback. So what does it mean to sit the kids in the circle and ask for feedback? I'm like, how did you feel about that math lesson? What worked about it? What didn't work about it? Why didn't you like these things? And really get that kind of real-time feedback so staff can then make those adjustments for the next unit or the next lesson. And so, like I said, I've never heard of circles being used quite in that way, and I think it has a lot of really interesting potential and is scalable, right? And then it would allow kids to understand that format when it comes time to like have to repair things, because that's when it can get kind of, it's easier to talk about like what you didn't like about math, a lot harder to talk about what you didn't like about a particular student or a particular cultural thing in class. So that was it. It was a really awesome meeting. Our next meeting is February 27th, 3 o'clock, as always. Everyone is welcome. Peter or Eric, anything to add?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you for your own personal, first of all, your knowledge, understanding, and your commitment to this that has really enabled this committee to get into places and give us a good illumination of what's going on in the school district. And I think you're adding a lot of value here, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
The other thing I like to say, that's about this as goes on, when I see these presentations and they're coming from all over the place, different areas, I always see goals on the slides. I always see data, talking about data. I always talking about response, and then these kind of things. These are concepts. They tell me how much the culture, the continuous improvement, the thought process of continuous has entered the culture of our school districts. That we don't talk about continuous improvement explicitly, but you just look at somebody's presentation. It's like, oh, it's all there. Because they're thinking it. They don't have to think about it explicitly. It's in how we think and how culturally we do things. And it's a real compliment to the administrative team and our teaching staff and everybody who's really, and it really shows how hard people are trying to improve the quality of
And the level of
education.
intentionality, right? Because
Exactly.
I think it's like that concept of like trying hard sort of isn't good enough, right? It's also about being intentional, being grounded, right? Being focused, and I agree with you. I think it's
it
that
shows up
aspect of
in
it.
everywhere. And
Yeah.
we only post hole. We look at this in detail. We look at that in
right.
detail, and we don't see 90% or 95% of what goes on because we just simply can't. But every time you this is what they call it, you dig a post hole, you see the same things and you see quality,
Yeah.
and that gives you reassurance that everything we do
Yeah.
is done with the same intentionality, the
I
same
agree.
quality, and it's been a really very interesting and reassuring set of discussions that we've
Yeah.
had.
Well, I agree, and I appreciate the compliment.
I'm going to just jump in
That's
really
okay.
quick. I just want to concur. I think the board as a whole feels the same way, that
Oh,
you're really
okay.
bringing a lot of
Absolutely.
value to this group. It's commendable
Wow,
what you're
thanks.
doing with your leadership.
It's so wonderful to watch. I mean, we can come in virtually and just close ourselves off and just listen to the conversation. Poor Lisa, I've been back there 3 times now saying, that was really an interesting presentation. And it fits in so well with the committee processes that you're using in learning information. And lots of time as a board, we don't have necessarily the time or the energy to hear that, and to see each of the buildings and things that they're doing it's really great. I loved it.
The one question I have is,
Yeah.
I wonder how can we highlight these great things that our schools are doing, aside from the board meetings, that I think the community should really hear about these great things that are happening.
I agree, and in fact, my one update about the convention was a conversation I actually had with Katie around having Katie in TLE more for that express purpose, because I think, as much as we talk about like, oh, we get really wonky and we talk about these things, there are these really great kernels of real community building, real intentionality, right? Real movement towards, I think, what our community knows and loves about our district, that are opportunities for us to highlight, which Katie already does a great job, I think, like through social and some of those pieces, but what would it mean to sort of add that element to TLE? So at the convention last week, Katie and I had a conversation about kind of what would it mean if she came to TLE, maybe not always, but certainly like when agenda items are like this, when there's a lot of really good sort of fodder for PR, for lack of a more classier way to say that. So, and I appreciate your compliments. I love chairing Teaching, Learning, and Equity Committee. I learn something new every time, and I would say I don't really do that much other than ask folks to come and present on what they do. And so to me, like, all the credit goes to our administrators, our staff, who are actually doing the work and having it available. So then when the question is, hey, can you talk about student voice? Or hey, can you talk about this? It's like, yep, here it is. And so, all I do is set the space for it to happen, and they're the ones
Well,
that do the
and
work.
you watch this and you think, this needs to be a breakout at WSB, because the way it was presented and the pieces about bringing forward the student voices and different ways to do it in different buildings and different approaches because of the different ages. I mean, that's information that's helpful for other kids to hear about and to see. It was.
The point about that, though, that I think I heard in the committee meeting, too, was you'll know that it's working when you see results. I mean, the whole point of student voice is increased student engagement, which ultimately is increased student performance. And I'm glad you came back to that word intentionality as I was writing that down, because you used that word in the meeting and about the SELE instruction. And I thought that, you know, your comments about that, about it being treated as an academic area like math or like language, to really take some year, I mean, to, you know, plan for the next couple of years, how to pick out those standards and, you know, to really take it seriously was a really, really key point too. And the student voice, both of them, I found it extremely interesting. And the student voice, because a lot of times you think, well, elementary kids, you know, kindergartners, what kind of conversation you read? And it was pretty neat. I mean, to hear what the kids were saying, and I thought it was great. But yeah, I would recommend maybe if you think about doing a WSB thing in a few years when you see how it's playing out. But it was really impressive.
Well, and to me, what's important to highlight, and you know, we can get into this as we move forward, but like when you think about school buildings as individual, like their own little mini ecosystems, right? And then there's the district, and there needs to be a level of continuity, but also a level of flexibility. And I feel like that student voice presentation to me was a great example of what it is to have like consistency at the core, right? We're all going towards the same piece, which is about elevating and infusing student voice for the purposes of, you know, pedagogical and cultural change in our buildings. But the way in which each building went about it is unique to the folks that are in that building, unique to the developmental natures of the kids that are in that building, but all towards the same surface, or towards the same goal. So for me, what I'd like to see, to your point around outcomes, is as the outcomes come in, and I'm confident that they will, to me that's the real magic there, is how do you take essentially a district level initiative and then allow the flexibility so that your staff have the autonomy to implement it in the way that feels the most authentic to who's in front of them and who's in their buildings. And that's one thing I think that our district is doing really well. And I would give a lot of kudos to Lisa Hype for that, because I think you do a really nice job of kind of setting the thing and then providing that sort of flexibility around that.
We agree.
And that's it, unless anyone else has more questions or compliments, because I will take those too.
Yes, Eric, you were saying something.
Well, I just want to say you should take some credit, Elizabeth, as well as the board should, because we identified an area that needed to be focused on, and that's why the board created this committee. So, you know, that's exactly what we should be doing as a board.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
we should all, you know, I'm proud to be part of a board that looks at something and looks at problems and tries to find solutions for them. And this is, although you may say it's a small thing, it's not a small thing. I think it's a very significant thing. So I wouldn't sell yourself short.
Thank you.
As well as the board too, for recognizing that this is an area to focus on.
All right. Next is Personnel Committee, Susan Fox.
Okay. We met yesterday, the 24th, with the MGEA representing educational assistants, and I'm happy to say that I think we have a tentative agreement for the master agreement for 2022-23. The thought was that the EAs might ratify yet this week, and we have a special board meeting next week, as you recall. If that happens, it may be on the agenda for us to ratify, otherwise it'll be the next board meeting, but that's it. And so we don't have another plan to meet. We are planning to meet then in a meet and confer on just handbook items with the MGEA representing teachers sometime. I think it probably will be early March, it looks like now, late February, early March. Don't have a date set yet.
Great.
All right, thank you, Susan.
I'm glad to hear that where I know we've been getting a lot of correspondence about that, so I'm glad to hear that was the result.
Yep, it was. I think we all feel good about it. So.
Yeah.
All right, next are possible action items. So the first one is 2023-24 2024 open enrollment recommendations.
The recommendation's been provided to you by Dr. Olson. I believe at the last meeting, he went through more detail and provided the rationale of why the number of seats that are displayed there are open. Per state law, DPI rules, the board needs to approve open seats for the following year by January. So this is the administrative recommendations. A total of 123 open enrollment seats throughout across all grades, plus 4 special ed seats.
Okay,
Oh, I have a question, but I can wait till discussion. Should I make a motion first?
let's make a motion and then,
I move approval of open enrollment seats for the 2023-2024 school year as presented.
I'll second that.
okay, any further discussion?
Yeah, I just have a question, Krista, for you, if you don't mind. Because if I'm recalling the last couple of years of open enrollment, this is a lower number.
Yeah,
If I'm remembering that right, I'm just curious, if that's true, how come?
yeah, it's been slightly lower. It's slightly lower. They've been relatively low overall, but yes, it is a little bit lower, and part of that is to do with like looking at our resident transfers in. I think, you know, for example, I just took a quick count today. It's kind of a moving target, but we're at 40 plus new, you know, students with IEPs that have move-ins, and that workload, caseload analysis plays into it too. We have just an increased demand in workload, and the staffing situation certainly plays into that as well, so that there is no guarantee we could expand our services even if we tried at
That's
some
fair.
levels, so,
Okay.
yeah.
And then clarifying question, this is gonna be an embarrassing one because I'm the one, part of the person who created this policy. But so we updated our policy around so that students that are already accepted in open enrollment, their siblings get automatically enrolled, right?
As far as I know, yes.
And so these numbers for special education then only apply for people who would be outside that policy. So putting it differently, I'm a second grader, I'm already open enrolled, I have a younger sib who has speech and language services and is gonna run.
I do believe there's a
kindergarten.
modification to that, with it's a may, it's not a flat guarantee for students with disabilities. There is still consideration of space.
Great.
Because
Great.
of, you know.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, in general, with siblings, they get priority. They're not
Well,
automatic.
we changed
if there's
the
space.
policy,
We did change the
we
policy.
changed the policy 2
Yeah.
years ago
Okay.
for
Right.
shall and not
Okay.
may. I can look back and reread it too.
Well, it was because we did have a couple of situations where we had a sibling, you know, we had a student who had been enrolled for a few years and they kept trying to get the sibling in, and it just, we felt like for families it was difficult, and it generally, you know, we did have a conversation with Jared at the time about numbers, and it isn't so many in terms of numbers that usually, you know,
Yeah.
generally works.
Mhm.
Special education services would be a different.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Krista.
All right, Peter?
And then the 4K number, how many of those typically continue as in the district? You may happen to have a thought on that.
Not,
I mean, it's 48. It's a large number.
What's the
it's always the largest, and then,
So, yeah, that's also.
but there's also quite a bit of drop that could.
I know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Nobody has. Okay, fine.
Well, if you look at these numbers, it's like
I don't know.
less than half.
What's your question, Peter?
No. Okay, so the 4K, we have 48 open enrollment
Yeah.
spots. I'm just seats. How many of those typically, and there's always the largest, as Eric points out.
Continue on.
How many of those continue? And I know a lot of people come to 4K just as that year only. And the question is, how many of that 48 would we expect to continue on is the question. And you probably have.
Well, and I would, if we could probably, I mean, I'm sure that we have that information. My only hesitancy about interpreting that is if you recall, up until this current year, 4K in Cottage Grove
Yep.
existed at Taylor Prairie, but also 2 community-based sites.
Yep.
And so you would have, let's say, a family from Sun Prairie, but their child was already
Mhm.
going to one of the child care centers here, enroll in our 4K, because then they get, you know, full-time care.
Mhm.
But we don't have those community-based sites anymore.
Mhm.
And so it would make me wonder if the attrition numbers would be
Different.
more, different and more stable, because now I'm like at Taylor Prairie,
Yep.
and I'm gonna
Right.
continue there potentially, as opposed to like, I'm at a community site and not only partially engaged with the school district, if that makes sense.
It does.
So anyway, all that to say is I would maybe look at that data.
Yeah.
I think like 2 years, like this year would be an interesting data points to look at.
Yeah, you're probably right. Okay, thank you.
Well, and it's also an optional program, right?
Yes.
So I think we have tended to have spaces.
But the question is how many students who are actively enrolled in 4K as open enrollment
Right.
continue as open enrolled students in Monona Grove in kindergarten?
Yes.
And it isn't all of them. I mean,
Yeah.
because they enroll for different reasons.
Yeah.
And that's an excellent question.
Mhm.
The number that jumped out at me was seventh grade, but it's a smaller class. It's
Yeah.
just, we've never had that many at the middle school before.
Yeah.
It's kind of good to see.
Yeah, I'm glad to see that too. I'm a little bummed, and I told Dan this last week. I'm bummed to see 0 at the high school again.
Well, we've
Yeah.
had that in the past.
I know. Last year too.
Right, because
I know.
small classrooms, I mean, it just doesn't work.
I mean-
You don't want to overcrowd them. I mean, because we have done that years ago, and we don't want to
Yeah.
repeat that.
I know. I both understand. I can hope understand and be disappointed.
Right.
But yes, I get it.
We want to have exactly the capacity of our of resident enrollment,
Yeah.
but if in an ideal world, but it doesn't work out that way.
Well, and what's don't we have leeway these are the numbers we choose, but
Yeah.
Right, and there's cushions built in for residencies and things like that. and I think
until, when is it?
that, April, May,
Okay,
yeah.
And we can go up but not down.
We can't go
Right.
down, right?
Right.
right.
In Monona, there's a lot of complexes that are being built. Is that impacting growth at all?
No.
Not
I mean-
so far. I mean, there's one that may have families, but it won't be built for a while,
Yeah.
a year or two. So it'll be slower. I mean, Monona's growth has more been from changing over, senior citizens moving to condos or whatever and selling houses. We've had more families. But, I keep remembering a previous superintendent reminding me that you've got to have constant move-in to maintain the enrollment, because the kids are going through the elementary, obviously, and
Right.
because that's always a concern when you start seeing a lot of kids on your street. It's great, but people start worrying about Winnequa and the capacity, and it still seems to me that we're in pretty good shape with Winnequa, and we do have some breathing space now with Maywood, so I think we should be good.
And no, I'm not moving out of my house.
I'm not anytime soon. So, yeah.
All right, we have a motion out, so we can go to vote. So all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Ayes have it, motion is carried. All right, next is the summer school teaching pay.
Recommendation, you can see the changes to the handbook. Currently, it's $25 per hour for summer school teachers and extended year programs for special ed students or teachers. Last year, the board approved additional compensation to the full-time teachers using ESSER funds, and based on the difficulty in getting staff and the pay that is in some of the surrounding districts, are recommending that both positions be increased to $32 an hour for this coming summer school program.
I recommend approval of the revised summer school teaching and extended school year ESY pay as presented.
I'll second that.
Any further discussion?
You have a question? How many hours of work is that? You know what the contract is?
Sure. When it's a 19-day summer school, it's about 90 hours for a full-time teacher.
Okay, thank you.
Is 32 going to be enough?
We based it on the starting pay of a teacher.
Okay.
That BA 0. So, and it's in the ballpark what others are paying. So we-
How does